Well, 2 summers ago, my family and we were invited to spend a day on Lake Memphremagnog, way up on the Canadian border. Friends of ours had a house on the lake and a small boat. So my friend Dave Weichel invited me and Jack and Blake on his boat to go fishing. We don't really do a lot of fishing, so this was an interesting and new experience for us. And we would go around to these different coves and these different bays in the lake, spend about 20 minutes in one spot, and having no success at all, no bites, Dave would move the boat to another location. We did this for about an hour and a half. After a while, we anchored in another spot. Dave encouraged us to try casting our lines on the other side of the boat. Jack caught a small fish. Blake caught a small fish. I caught nothing. So I said, I'm going to cast out to the deep part, because I'm bigger and stronger, and I can cast out further to where it's deeper. Not 5 or 10 feet, but maybe 20 or 40 feet. So I cast out to the deep part of the bay. And I wait. And suddenly my line became tight. I felt movement. It was hard. It was a struggle. Everyone gathered around as I started to reel in this heavy line. And struggled as I did, I managed to hoist my fishing pole up and over the bow of the boat to proudly display a massive stump and clumps of weeds. That was my catch. I was not successful. The weeds and the stump were certainly in the deeper part of the lake. At least my boys had a good time and caught some fish. So we're looking at the Gospel of Luke. And the Bible study that we're doing on Thursdays is also looking at the Gospel of Luke, these opening chapters of this wonderful book. Now, a way of context, Matthew, in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic Gospels. That word means to see them together. There are 3 different versions of the similar stories written by different people for different audiences. And unlike John's Gospel, these 3 Gospels share many of the same stories. And scholars believe that they're informed by some of the same earlier sources that these writers had access to. So it's fascinating when one of these Gospels features elements that are not present in the other ones. And in this case, Matthew and Mark, in their Gospels, they omit the story about the catch of fish. They both have stories of Jesus calling his first disciples, calling them from boats, calling them from the shore of the sea, very similar, but only Luke contains this specific story, this part of the narrative. And so we read that Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Gennesaret. He saw 2 brothers, Simon, who was also called Peter, and his brother Andrew. Now they were casting a net into the lake because they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus says, "and I will send you out to fish for people." And we read that at once they left their nets and they followed him. Going on from there, he saw other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed Jesus. Now that's the way that Matthew and Mark recount this story. All 3 of these authors include Jesus' suggestion that he was changing their vocation from being fishermen to fishers of people. And yet, again, it is interesting that only Luke specifically talks about this miraculous catch of fish. Now, we do know that Luke was not present for these events. His gospel is woven together from first-hand interviews, which is what he explains to Theophilus, who is the recipient of his story. He says in the very opening lines of the Gospel of Luke, he's writing it to Theophilus, and he said, my intent was to interview people, to write an orderly account of everything that you have heard. And that's what Luke did. Now, the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Gennesaret, in that region. What's interesting about it, it is the lowest freshwater lake on earth. Not necessarily the deepest, but it is the lowest, and the second lowest lake in the entire world. Anyone guess what the lowest lake in the world is? The Dead Sea. Yes, the Dead Sea. They're very close to one another. So the Sea of Galilee, here's what's interesting. Its elevation fluctuates between 705 and 686 feet below sea level. It's low. So we read in this context, Jesus, and we know this from the last couple of weeks, he's already drawing a crowd. People are eager to see this person, this rabbi, to listen to the word of God as delivered in this very unique way that Jesus does with power and with authority. So wherever he goes, there's crowds of people. So in this one particular instance, he decides to use one of the boats on the shore as a platform to speak from. Now in the boats, he can push off and address the people who are present. But the crowd would no longer be able to get at him. Luke says they were pressing in on him. So he gets into Simon Peter's boat. We'll call him Simon Peter. He's referred to both. Simon Peter's boat. And he has him pull away from the shore while he speaks to people. Now, Luke doesn't tell us what Jesus taught. He does in many of the other passages in the gospel. But for some reason, he leaves out the content of Jesus' teaching. But he does say that after teaching, Jesus turns to Simon and tells the fisherman to put down his nets for a catch. Now, Simon has already been pretty accommodating to Jesus. After all, he was trying to clean his nets of all the debris that they had picked up after working all night long with no success. And then Jesus shows up and commandeers his boat. But Simon Peter takes him out. Now, Jesus wants Simon to drop his nets again. It's already been a long and fruitless night, so you can imagine. Simon complains a little bit, provides an honest and understandable excuse, but ultimately he does what Jesus asks of him. And then we read, when the nets are dropped, they immediately are filled with so many fish that these nets begin to break. And it is in this unbelievable and unexpected abundance that Peter knows he's in the presence and the power of God in Jesus. Peter has what we call an epiphany. We are, after all, in the season of Epiphany. He has this profound religious experience. Call it a conversion, if you will. An encounter with Jesus that changes him and changes everything in his world. He will never be the same after this moment. But he acknowledges this, and he says, "Leave me. Leave me. I'm not worthy to be in your presence." And then we read, and I love this about the story, Jesus doesn't leave. He doesn't condemn. He doesn't forsake. Jesus doesn't go away. What Jesus does is he reveals to Simon the potential that lives in him if he is willing to participate in the work of God. He calls out something that Jesus sees in Simon Peter that probably Simon Peter didn't see in himself. And probably no one else saw in him. But Jesus did. Jesus had another calling, a higher calling, a different vocation from him that would change the path of his life. Jesus stays with him because he believes in him and responds by saying not to fear. For when you're in the presence of grace, in the presence of God, there is no fear. There's only love. Luke then tells us that the boats pulled up to the shore, and the disciples left everything and followed him. Now, the way it's written makes it seem like at that very moment, James, John, and Simon just abandoned everything and walked off into the horizon with Jesus. But more than likely, Luke is telling us that this was the moment that made them decide to follow Jesus. Because we see that these three men had formed some sort of fishing co-op. Luke tells us that these men were Simon's partners, which was very common at that time. This system of fishing helped ensure that if one person had a bad night fishing, they were still pooling together their income with others. Again, a very common practice back then. So they succeeded or failed together. Whatever it was, they were in it together. And there's some power to that as well. So often we feel like we have to do everything alone. Even if God's calling us to do something, it can be very difficult if we feel that we are alone. But we are meant to be together, not only to partner with God, but to partner with other people. There is strength in numbers, in solidarity, in support, in this co-op. And they experienced this miracle together. Now, just a brief note about miracles. Like most of Jesus' miracles that we read, they served a function as well. They had a legitimate purpose beyond just amazing the onlookers. Very seldom did Jesus ever do a miracle so that people would be amazed. He wasn't a magician. These miracles had a purpose to them. To feed people, to bless people, to nourish people, to heal people so that they could go back into their communities, back into their families. And it's probably the case for this one as well. This once-in-a-lifetime catch probably helped support these men's families so that after they left, their families would be provided for. And this moment becomes incredibly important in Peter and Jesus' friendship. This moment that Luke includes, but the others don't, becomes a bookend to their friendship. And I want to explain. We're going to fast forward a little bit. So fast forward to the night that Jesus was arrested. Most of you are familiar to that story. We usually look at that around Holy Week, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday. But for today, humor me. We're going to go there. 3 times it was Peter. He was asked by the onlookers if he was one of Jesus' followers. And do you remember what Peter said all 3 times? He said, "Nope, I've never met this man. I don't know this man." Right? It was fear of others. Peter denied having anything to do with Jesus. Now, knowing Peter, he probably carried that guilt more acutely than any other disciples might have. All the disciples fled. All the disciples were scared. Peter was the one that denied he even knew Jesus. And knowing Peter, he probably carried that weight and that guilt and that shame with him. Now, after these events, Jesus is gone. Fishermen, Peter and his friends, his colleagues don't know what to do. They've been following Jesus for years, so they return to their lifestyle. They return to being fishermen. That's what they knew. So they go back to that. Then John's gospel tells us this story. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples. And by the way, this is after Easter. Listen for similarities. Afterwards, Jesus again appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. Jesus said, "Throw your nets on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And when they did, they were unable to haul the net because of the large number of fish. Sound familiar? Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, we think it was John, this disciple said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus then has a conversation with Peter and reinstates Peter. And so in these Gospels, Jesus uses a huge catch of fish to initially call Peter into ministry, to change his vocation, to change his heart, to open his eyes and his minds, to give him a calling. And then with this other miraculous catch of fish, he reinstates Peter. This act and this miracle is a beautiful example of the Lord's compassion. And by revisiting this story, this event, Jesus communicates something very valuable. "Peter, I called you, and despite everything, I am still calling you. You have an important role in this movement. I will never leave you or forsake you." Can you imagine how Peter responded to that? Probably remembered back to the first time it happened, to the first time he met Jesus, to what it felt like to have someone know you, recognize you, believe in you. And it all came back to Peter. And we know from history and other records that Peter was an amazing evangelist. Peter was the head of the church in Jerusalem. He did so much after this story to continue to follow Christ, to be a loving disciple of Jesus. And I think this story, when you look at the bookends of it, reminds us that even with our doubts, even with our sins and our failures, we are not forsaken or forgotten by God. Jesus stepped into Peter's world as a fisherman. He demonstrated his power and he issued an invitation to Peter and to the other disciples. Friends, Jesus does the same with us. Steps into our worlds, into our contexts, into our careers, into our everyday, sometimes ordinary lives, steps into those realities and gives us an invitation and an opportunity to cast out our nets, to go into the deep, and to see what God can do in and through us. We are invited to explore areas of potential that are even beyond the perceived limits of our own resources, our own knowledge, our own energy. Sometimes, and perhaps this is the time, we might need to cast out of the safe and the shallow, the familiar and the comfortable confines. Sometimes we need to trust God's call and go into the deep. And in times of emptiness, when we feel like our nets are empty, in times of despair, when it seems like our efforts are in vain, and like the disciples, we may be weary and exhausted, may we hear the call of Jesus to not give up, to try again, to cast our hopes into something new, cast our hopes into the deep. May we respond in faith and see our lives transformed like those first disciples, so we may experience God's provisions and partner with God to change the world, one person at a time, one line at a time. Amen.